The tablet weighs less than 2 pounds. You can hold it in one hand if you're careful, 4,000 years condensed into baked clay, small enough to slip into a jacket pocket, dense enough to rewrite everything you thought you knew about human origins. CBS 4561 sits in climate-controlled storage at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The catalogue number is sterile, bureaucratic. The content is anything but. 3 columns of wedge-shaped cuneiform pressed into clay sometime around 1900 BC, recovered from the ancient city of Nippur in what is now Iraq. The tablet is light brown, reconstructed from 3 fragments that spent millennia separated in the earth before archaeologists pieced them back together. When you read the translation, you understand why someone thought this text worth preserving, worth copying, worth burying in a library that would survive when the city above it turned to dust. The text describes the creation of human beings, not metaphorically, not symbolically, with procedural specificity that reads less like poetry and more like a technical manual. The goddess Ninmah and the god Enki collaborate on fashioning humans from clay mixed with the blood of a sacrifice god. They experiment. They make mistakes, beings that are malformed, imperfect. They refine their technique, and they succeed in creating workers, servants, a labour force to replace the lesser gods called Igigi, who had grown weary of maintaining the earth. The creators in this account are called the Anunnaki. The name appears across hundreds of tablets spanning thousands of years of Mesopotamian civilization, not occasionally, not in fragments, consistently across legal documents, medical texts, astronomical records, temple hymns, epic poetry, king lists, and administrative receipts. The Anunnaki are described as those who came from the heavens to the earth, who established kingship, who taught the arts of civilization, who judged the fates of mortals and gods alike, and who, according to patterns in later texts, eventually withdrew, became distant, fell silent in ways that transformed the entire religious landscape of the ancient Near East. This is not fringe archaeology. These are mainstream academic sources, tablets housed in the British Museum, the Louvre, the Ashmolean, the University of Pennsylvania, the Oriental Institute of Chicago, translations published by Oxford, Cambridge, university presses around the world. The texts exist. The translations are verifiable. What remains contested, what generates endless debate among scholars and researchers, is what these texts actually meant to the people who wrote them. Were the Anunnaki gods, in the mythological sense, symbolic representations of natural forces, theological constructs, literary devices to explain the cosmos? Were they historical rulers whose reigns became mythologized over centuries of retelling? Or were the Sumerians recording something else entirely, preserving accounts of actual events in the only conceptual framework available to Bronze Age scribes? That question has no easy answer, but the texts themselves tell a story with remarkable internal consistency, a narrative with a beginning, middle and end, an arc that moves from arrival to activity to eventual departure or withdrawal. The entire story, as the Sumerians preserved it, carved into clay tablets that would outlast empires. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. This journey through Mesopotamian archives works best in the quiet hours, when you can let your mind follow the evidence wherever it leads without distraction. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or working through a restless night, you're about to encounter texts that have puzzled scholars for over a century. Because here's what makes this investigation different from casual Anunnaki content, we're going to follow the actual sources, tablet by tablet, museum catalogue number by museum catalogue number. We'll examine what mainstream scholars say these texts mean. Then we'll look at what those same scholars acknowledge they cannot easily explain, the details that don't fit conventional interpretations, the patterns that suggest something more complex than simple mythology. We won't claim proof. We won't force conclusions. we'll simply walk through the archive the Sumerians left behind and ask what they thought they were recording. By the end, you'll have encountered the primary sources yourself, traced the narrative from arrival to departure, and formed your own assessment of what these texts might represent. The story begins not with the Anunnaki's arrival, but with what the tablets claim existed before they came. Because understanding what they found or created on Earth requires first understanding what the Sumerians believed preceded that pivotal moment when, in their words, kingship descended from heaven and civilization began. Before the arrival, what the texts actually say. The Enuma Elish opens with a temporal marker, when on high. Not in the beginning, which implies a starting point of time itself, but when on high, when the heavens above. The opening lines, preserved on 7 clay tablets discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, and now scattered across museum collections, describe a time before the separation of cosmic elements, before heaven and earth were named, before the gods themselves came into being. British Museum tablet 93017, one of the key Enuma Elish sources, contains these opening passages in Akkadian cuneiform. The text reads, "When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, when primordial Abzu, their begetter, and Mummu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters were mingled together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. This is pre-creation, not absence, but undifferentiation. Waters mingled, potential unmanifest. The primordial parents Abzu and Tiamat represent fresh water and salt water, the fundamental elements from which, according to Babylonian cosmology, everything else emerged. From their union came the first generation of gods, but the Enuma Elish is a Babylonian text, compiled around 1200 BC, significantly later than the earliest Sumerian sources. When we trace back to older Sumerian tablets, the picture shifts. The Sumerians don't begin with cosmic chaos. They begin with something already present. The earth exists, but it is unworked. Fields exist, but no one tends them. Canals could be dug, but no one digs them. The raw materials are present, organization is absent. This matters because it suggests 2 very different starting conditions. The Babylonian Enuma Elish implies creation from formless void. The Sumerian texts imply arrival upon a planet that already existed but lacked civilization. Which version is older? Which is more accurate to the original tradition? Scholars debate this. The Sumerian language predates Akkadian and Babylonian by centuries, but the Enuma Elish, though written later in Akkadian, may preserve older oral tradition. The Sumerian king list, that extraordinary document preserved in multiple versions across museum collections, makes an unambiguous claim in its opening line. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The Weld Blundell prism, housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and catalogued as WB 444, contains one of the most complete versions of this list. The text was inscribed during the reign of King Utu, Hegel of Uruk, around 2100 BCE, but it claims to record a chronology stretching back thousands of years before the Great Flood. Kingship descended from heaven. This is not metaphorical language in the context of the list. The text proceeds to name specific kings, specific cities, specific reign lengths. It treats the descent of kingship as a datable event in the same historical register as the reigns that followed. The first city to receive this descended kingship was Eridu, the southernmost city of Sumer, located near the ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf. Eridu holds special significance in Sumerian tradition. It was considered the first city, the place where civilization began. Archaeological excavations at the site, conducted from the 1940s onward, revealed temple structures dating to the Ubaid period around 5400 BC, making it one of the oldest known temple sites in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians themselves believed Eridu was the home of Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and, critically, the god most consistently portrayed as favourable toward humanity. The Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary Sumerian tablet excavated from Nippur, picks up this theme. Though much of the tablet is damaged, the surviving portions describe Enki's role in preserving humanity during the flood by warning the king Ziusudra to build an ark. The text states that before the flood, after cities were built and kingship had descended, the gods decided to destroy humanity because of overpopulation or noise. The text is unclear which. Enki defies this decision, preserving the human species by instructing Ziusudra in shipbuilding techniques. What is striking in these accounts is the consistent pattern. Humans exist, cities exist, civilization exists, but this state of affairs was initiated by divine action. The gods came down, kingship descended, knowledge was transferred. The Sumerians do not portray themselves as developing civilization independently and then inventing gods to explain natural phenomena. They portray gods, specifically the Anunnaki, as arriving in a world that was ready for cultivation and organization, but lacked the knowledge to achieve it. The word Anunnaki itself provides linguistic clues. In Sumerian, it's written as Anunnaki or Anunna, with variations across different periods and texts. The etymology is debated, but most scholars pass it as princely offspring or those of royal blood. The An component relates to heaven or sky. The Ki component relates to earth. So even in the name, there's an implication of connection between heaven and earth, sky and ground. But who exactly were the Anunnaki? The term is used inconsistently across texts, which has frustrated scholars attempting to pin down a precise definition. In some contexts, Anunnaki refers to the great gods collectively, the major deities like An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nanna, Utu and Inanna. In other contexts, it refers specifically to the judges of the underworld. In still other texts, it seems to designate a broader class of divine beings distinct from the Igigi, the younger gods who, according to the Atrahasis epic, were assigned hard labour before humans were created to replace them. The most consistent definition appears in texts from Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer. There the Anunnaki are the children or descendants of An, the sky god. They are the pantheon's elite, the decision-makers, the ones who hold authority over cosmic and earthly affairs. Tablet after tablet from Nippur's temple libraries, now catalogued as CBS tablets in the Penn Museum collections, refer to the Anunnaki in council, rendering judgments, distributing authority, allocating divine responsibilities. The Atrahasis epic, translated and published by W. G. Lambert and A. R. Millard in their authoritative 1969 edition, provides the clearest narrative of Anunnaki activity after arrival. The text survives in multiple versions across several tablets, the most complete being Old Babylonian copies from around 1700 BC. The epic opens with a description of divine labour division. When the gods were man, they did forced labour, they bore drudgery. Great was the drudgery of the gods, the forced labour was heavy, the misery too much. This is an extraordinary opening. Gods performing manual labour, not creating from thought or word, but digging canals, hauling earth, building irrigation systems. The text specifies that this labour lasted 40 years. A symbolic or literal duration is unclear, but the point is emphasis on prolonged, exhausting effort. The gods complain, they organise, and they rebel. The rebellion is directed against Enlil, the chief administrator of earth operations under An. The labouring gods, identified as Igigi, burn their tools and march on Enlil's dwelling at night. Enlil, alarmed, summons the senior Anunnaki council and from heaven and Enki from the subterranean waters to deliberate on the crisis. The solution they devise is the creation of humans, beings who will bear the labour burden so the gods can rest. Why does this narrative matter for understanding arrival? Because it implies that divine presence on earth was not effortless. The texts do not describe Anunnaki as omnipotent beings who simply willed civilization into existence. They describe Anunnaki and their subordinate Igigi engaging in physical labour to terraform the landscape, literally digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, according to some versions, establishing agricultural infrastructure, building city foundations. The language is concrete, procedural, engineering focused. Mainstream scholars interpret this as mythology reflecting human social structures, elites forcing labourers to build irrigation systems, with the story projected onto a divine plane to justify earthly hierarchies. The gods labour and rebel just as humans labour and sometimes rebel. It's a reflection of Mesopotamian class dynamics. But notice what the texts themselves claim: the labour was necessary because the earth, though existing, was not yet organised for habitation. Marshes needed draining, rivers needed channeling, fields needed preparing. The Anunnaki arrival, in this reading, was not into an empty world, but into a world requiring substantial modification before it could support the civilization they intended to establish. The Sumerian king list reinforces this sequence. Before the flood, kingship is in specific cities, held by specific named rulers who reign for implausibly long periods. 28,800 years for Alulim, the first king of Eridu, 36,000 years for Alaljar, the second king. 8 kings across 5 cities reign for a combined total of 241,200 years before the flood sweeps over the land. After the flood, kingship descends again, this time to Kish, and reign lengths, while still extraordinary by modern standards, become progressively shorter and more plausible. Scholars universally acknowledge these pre-flood reign lengths cannot be literal years as we understand them. Theories range from sexagesimal mathematical errors in later copying to symbolic numerology to records kept in different units of time measurement. But setting aside the duration problem, the list structure is clear. There is a before state, re-flood, extraordinary conditions, direct divine governance, and an after state, flood, decreasing reign lengths, gods becoming more distant. This implies the Anunnaki presence was not constant. It changed over time, initially more direct, more involved, more physically present, later more distant, more removed, more mediated through human intermediaries. The texts preserve this arc if you trace them chronologically through the periods they describe. In the Enuma Elish, after the younger god Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the cosmos from her body, he organises the Anunnaki into administrative roles. Tablet V of the Enuma Elish, preserved in multiple copies including British Museum 93017, describes Marduk's establishment of cosmic order. He appointed 300 Anunnaki of heaven to guard the heavens, and defined them as a guard for the earth. 600 he stationed in heaven and earth. After he had organised all the rules and fashioned all the decrees, he divided the offices among the Anunnaki of heaven and earth. 300 in heaven, 300 on earth, 600 total. The text is specific about numbers, about divisions, about assignments. Whether these numbers are literal or symbolic, they indicate a sophisticated organisational structure. The Anunnaki are not an undifferentiated mass of divine beings. They have ranks, roles, jurisdictions. Some oversee celestial phenomena, others manage earthly affairs. There is hierarchy, specialisation, administration, and there is arrival. The texts consistently use language implying movement from elsewhere to here, descended from heaven, came down to earth, established dwelling places among mortals. This is not emergence from the earth itself. No autochthonous origin myths for the Anunnaki as a collective, though individual gods have birth narratives. This is arrival from outside, from above, from a heavenly realm that the texts describe as pre-existing and separate from the earth. What was that heavenly realm? The texts are maddeningly vague. The heaven or an simply means the sky, the realm above. Some texts reference specific celestial locations. Anu's heaven, the highest realm, Enlil's heaven, the atmospheric realm, Enki's Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean. But these are described more as territories than as places in any geographical sense we would recognise. Later interpreters have mapped these onto planets, stars, distant worlds. The ancient texts do not make such identifications explicit. They speak of heaven as heaven, a realm accessible to gods but separate from mortal earth. Whether this was understood as a physical location or a dimensional state or a theological concept is genuinely unclear from the cuneiform sources. What is clear is that the Anunnaki were understood to have come from this elsewhere, to have organised Earth according to plans or patterns they brought with them, and to have established humanity as a workforce to maintain what they had built. The gods arrived with knowledge. They brought the me, those fundamental decrees or cultural innovations that encompassed everything from kingship to brewing beer. They transferred portions of this knowledge to humans, particularly to kings and priests, who served as intermediaries. The text called Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the me, describes how the goddess Inanna travels from her city Uruk to Enki's city Eridu, and through a combination of charm and cunning, acquires the me from Enki while he is drunk. She loads over 100 me onto her boat and transports them back to Uruk, despite Enki's attempts to reclaim them once he sobers up. The me includes such specific items as the art of metalworking, the craft of leatherworking, the role of the scribe, the position of king, the function of priesthood, musical instruments, sexual practices, legal procedures, and even the ability to speak with authority. These are not abstract divine powers. They are specific technologies, social roles, and institutional functions. The text treats them as transferable, as things that can be moved from one location to another, possessed by one deity and acquired by another. This implies the me were understood as something more concrete than mere concepts, perhaps as actual objects, perhaps as encoded knowledge, perhaps as operational protocols that required teaching and transmission. The Sumerians did not believe they invented these things. They believed they received them, that the Anunnaki arrived possessing them, and that over time, through various means, divine instructions, sacred rituals, theft as in Inanna's case, these elements of civilization were passed to humanity. So the picture before the Anunnaki arrival, according to the texts themselves, a world existing but unorganized, raw materials present but unworked, potential unrealized. Then, at a specific moment the texts treat as historical, the Anunnaki descended from heaven. They organized themselves into administrative hierarchies. They began the massive labour of terraforming and infrastructure development. They encountered resistance from their own subordinate gods and resolved it by creating humans as a replacement workforce. And they established kingship, priesthood, and the fundamental institutions of civilization by transferring knowledge, the me, from their own possession to human custody. This is the story the tablets tell consistently across centuries of textual tradition. Whether it describes mythology, metaphor, misunderstood history, or something else entirely, the internal narrative is coherent. The Anunnaki arrival is not portrayed as creation ex nihilo. It is portrayed as colonization, organization, transfer of knowledge to an existing world. And if the texts describe arrival this precisely, the question becomes, do they describe departure with equal specificity? The next part of the story depends on understanding how the Anunnaki organized themselves once present on Earth, what roles they assigned, what internal conflicts emerged, and how their relationship with humanity evolved from creation through collaboration to eventual crisis. The assembly and the hierarchy. The gods did not rule by consensus. They ruled by assembly, a distinction that matters because assembly implies structure, voting procedures, hierarchies of authority that supersede individual divine will. The Mesopotamian texts are explicit about this. Decisions of cosmic importance were not made by solitary decree from a supreme being. They emerged from deliberation among the senior Anunnaki, meeting in formal council, following protocols that the tablets describe with procedural specificity. The assembly appears repeatedly across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian sources under various names: the Assembly of the Gods, the Council of the Anunnaki, the Gathering of the Seven who decree fate. Its membership varied depending on context and time period, but the core structure remained consistent: a presiding deity, senior members with voting authority, and junior gods who attended but did not vote. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the presiding authority was An, the sky god, whose name literally means heaven, and dwells in the highest heaven, removed from daily affairs, functioning more as chairman than active executive. The actual administration of earth and heaven fell to Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord Storm. Enlil's role is complex and frequently misunderstood by casual readers of Mesopotamian mythology. He is not a benevolent father figure. He is the executive enforcer, the one who implements decisions, the god of authority, storm, and, crucially, of binding decrees. Enlil's temple at Nippur, called the Rintans, served as the functional capital of the Sumerian divine realm. Kings from all Mesopotamian city-states travelled to Nippur to have their legitimacy confirmed by Enlil's priesthood. The city produced more cuneiform tablets than any other Sumerian site, tens of thousands of texts now catalogued in museum collections worldwide. These texts consistently portray Enlil as the supreme earthly authority among the Anunnaki, the one whose word becomes binding law, the one whose temple houses the Tablet of Destinies. The Tablet of Destinies, sometimes plural, Tablets of Destinies, functions as a kind of cosmic control mechanism. Whoever possesses it holds supreme executive authority over the universe. The Epic of Ans, preserved in multiple versions including fragments at the Louvre and British Museum, tells the story of this tablet's theft by the bird demon Ans while Enlil was bathing. With the tablet, Ans gained the ability to decree fates, to command the gods, to override natural order. The younger god Ninurta, son of Enlil, eventually defeats Ans and recovers the tablet, restoring proper authority. Why does a tablet grant cosmic power? The Mesopotamian worldview treated written decrees as ontologically effective. To write something in the proper form, with the proper authority, was to make it so. The Tablet of Destinies encoded the fundamental operating principles of reality. Possessing it meant controlling those principles. This is not magic in the fantasy sense. It's closer to possessing the root administrative access to a system, the authority to change fundamental parameters that others must obey. Below An and Enlil in the hierarchy stood Enki, god of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed fed all springs, rivers and wells. Enki's Sumerian name means Lord of the Earth or Lord of the Ground. In Akkadian, he is called Ea. His temple at Eridu, the Abzu, was considered the oldest temple in the world. Enki's role in the divine council is distinctive. He is the problem solver, the clever one, the god most consistently sympathetic to humanity. Across multiple narratives, the flood stories, the creation accounts, the distribution of the me, Enki appears as the Anunnaki member most willing to share knowledge with humans, most reluctant to endorse human extinction, most innovative in finding solutions that circumvent Enlil's harsh decrees. This creates an internal tension in the divine hierarchy, a recurring pattern where Enlil decides something severe, Enki subverts it through cleverness, and the assembly must adjudicate between them. The assembly also included the mother goddess, called by various names across different periods: Ninhursag, Ninmah, Nintu, Belet-Ili. She functions as the creative counterpart to Enki in human fashioning, the one whose womb produces the first humans, according to the Enki and Ninmah text. CBS 2168 at Penn Museum, a fragment of this myth, describes her role in the creation process with obstetric language. She is the divine midwife who brings forth humanity. Then there are the cosmic regulators, Nanna the moon god, called Sin in Akkadian, his son Utu the sun god, called Shamash in Akkadian, and Utu's sister Inanna of love and war, called Ishtar in Akkadian. These three oversee the measurement of time, the cycles of the calendar, the navigation of caravans and ships. Their temples maintained astronomical observatories. Their priests calculated eclipse cycles, planetary movements, seasonal festivals. The knowledge they guarded was mathematical, precise, empirically testable. This senior tier of Anunnaki, An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nanna, Utu, Inanna, are frequently referenced as the seven who decree fate. They form the executive committee of the Divine Assembly, the ones whose votes carry ultimate weight. Decisions made by these seven become cosmic law, but the assembly included more than seven. The Enuma Elish specifies 50 great gods, with 300 Anunnaki of heaven and 300 of earth beneath them. Other texts reference different numbers, but all agree on a tiered structure. At the top, the decision makers. In the middle, the administrators and specialists, gods of specific crafts, cities, natural phenomena. At the bottom, the Igigi, the labourer gods whose rebellion precipitated human creation. The Igigi are fascinating precisely because their status is ambiguous. Are they Anunnaki or separate from them? Different texts give different answers. The Atrahasis epic treats them as subordinate to the Anunnaki, assigned by the senior gods to dig rivers and build infrastructure. When they rebel, they march on Enlil's compound at night, surround his house, and threaten violence if their demands aren't met. Enlil, genuinely frightened, summons An from heaven and Enki from the Abzu for an emergency council. The scene is dramatic precisely because it subverts expectations. Enlil, the supreme earthly authority, the executor of divine will, the god whose word is law, Enlil is scared. The text says his face pales. He bolts his door. He sends his vizier to wake An and Enki. This is not an omnipotent deity effortlessly managing subordinates. This is an administrator facing a labour revolt with inadequate security, needing backup from higher authorities to negotiate a settlement. The solution they propose, creating humans to take over the work, requires sacrifice from the divine ranks. One of the Igigi leaders, Geshtui, also called Waila in some versions, is executed. His blood is mixed with clay, and from this combination, humans are formed. The text is explicit. Humans contain divine essence, the blood of a slain god, which explains human consciousness, creativity, and cognitive capability. Humans are not purely material. They carry a spark of the divine within them. This creation resolves the labour crisis, but creates a new problem: population growth. Humans reproduce rapidly. Within what the text calls 1200 years, possibly literal, possibly symbolic, humanity has multiplied to the point where their noise disturbs Enlil's sleep. The text uses the word hububu, meaning uproar, clamour, tumult. Enlil cannot rest because of the constant noise of human activity. His solution is extermination, not all at once, but through escalating measures. First he sends plague. Enki teaches humans healing techniques, and they survive. Then he sends drought. Enki instructs humans in irrigation and deep well drilling, and they survive. Then he sends famine. Enki shows humans how to fish the oceans, and they survive. Finally, Enlil convenes the assembly and proposes the flood, a total reset, wiping humanity from the earth so the gods can rest in silence. This is where the assembly structure becomes critical. Enlil cannot simply decree the flood unilaterally. He must bring the proposal to the council of senior Anunnaki. They debate, and they vote to approve it, and agrees. The other senior gods agree, except Enki. Enki does not openly oppose the decision that would violate assembly protocol. Instead, he finds a loophole. He has sworn not to reveal the plan to humans directly. So he speaks to a reed wall in the temple at Shuruppak, knowing the pious king Ziusudra is on the other side of that wall, listening. Read wall, pay attention to my words, Enki says, and proceeds to give detailed instructions for building a boat with precise measurements, waterproofing techniques, and survival provisions. This episode reveals something crucial about Anunnaki governance. It operated by rules, even internally. Enki couldn't simply override Enlil's decree. He couldn't violate his oath. But he could work around it through cleverness, exploiting the letter of the law while violating its spirit. And apparently, this was acceptable within the divine system after the flood, when Enlil discovers Ziusudra survived and realizes Enki must have warned him there's anger but not punishment. Enki's action is grudgingly acknowledged as within his rights as a member of the assembly. After the flood, when the handful of surviving humans and animals emerge from the boat, Enlil's rage evaporates. He sees the offering Ziusudra makes, smells the roasted meat, and realizes the gods have made a mistake. Without humans to tend the earth, to offer sacrifices, to maintain the temples, the gods must return to manual labour themselves. The Gilgamesh flood account, preserved on Tablet C 3375 in the British Museum, describes the gods gathering around Utnapishtim's sacrifice like flies, desperately hungry because human extinction means no more offerings. The assembly reverses course. Ziusudra, called Utnapishtim in the Akkadian versions, Atrahasis in others, is granted immortality and relocated to a distant dwelling place at the mouth of the rivers. Humanity is allowed to continue, but with modifications. The goddess Nintu, another name for Ninakal, redesigns human reproduction to include miscarriages, stillbirths, and women who don't bear children, thereby limiting population growth. Death becomes universal for all humans except Ziusudra, and the gods withdraw to a greater distance, mediating their interaction with humanity through kings and priests rather than direct contact. This pattern, assembly decision, Enki's resistance, compromise solution, repeats across multiple mythological narratives. It suggests internal Anunnaki politics were complex, factional, marked by genuine disagreement. There was no monolithic Anunnaki agenda. There were competing priorities, Enlil's emphasis on order and authority versus Enki's emphasis on knowledge and preservation, with other gods aligning based on circumstance. Inanna represents another faction entirely. Her descent to the underworld, preserved on tablets including CBS 13932 at Penn Museum, describes her challenging her sister Ereshkigal's authority over the realm of the dead. Inanna passes through 7 gates, surrendering a piece of clothing or jewellery at each, until she stands naked and powerless before the throne. The Anunnaki of the underworld, functioning here as judges, pronounce sentence upon her, and she is killed, her corpse hung on a hook. Only through Enki's intervention, sending creatures he fashions from the dirt beneath his fingernails to bargain with Ereshkigal, is Inanna eventually resurrected. But the law of the underworld requires a substitute. Someone must take her place. She returns to the surface to discover her husband Dumuzi has not mourned her death, but instead sits on her throne wearing fine clothes. In fury, she hands him over to the demons who drag him to the underworld as her replacement. This story reveals the Anunnaki were subject to cosmic laws even they couldn't override. Inanna, a member of the 7 who decree fate, cannot simply refuse death when judged by the assembly of the underworld. She needs Enki's cleverness to escape. And even then, substitutionary sacrifice is required. Someone must pay the debt. The rules bind gods as well as mortals. The assembly structure explains how decisions about humanity were made. It also explains why those decisions sometimes contradicted each other. Plague and healing, drought and irrigation knowledge, famine and survival techniques, flood and preservation. Each represented a different faction's victory in the ongoing council deliberations. For humans living under this system, it meant civilization was not the gift of a singular benevolent deity. It was the result of divine politics, of knowledge transferred by sympathetic gods ruling against the preferences of authoritarian gods ruling, with humanity surviving in the contested space between divine factions. The text described this arrangement lasting for long spans, the kingless pre-flood chronology, the 1200 years of the Atrahasis before each plague, the building of cities and temples and irrigation systems under direct divine supervision. But it was not static. The assembly's composition shifted. The balance of power among the Anunnaki changed, particularly after the flood, and the nature of divine-human interaction evolved from direct presence to increasingly mediated contact through institutional intermediaries. Understanding this hierarchy, who held authority, how decisions were made, what internal conflicts divided the Anunnaki, is essential for making sense of what comes next. Because the most controversial question in all of Mesopotamian studies is not whether the Anunnaki arrived or what they did after arrival. It's why the labour they needed done required creating humanity in the first place. What were the Igigi doing that proved so burdensome? What was the work humanity was designed to perform? And what does that reveal about the Anunnaki's purpose on Earth? The tablets describe this with uncomfortable clarity, not metaphor, not symbol. Procedure and purpose encoded in clay, preserved for 4,000 years, waiting for the question to be asked properly. The fashioning of humanity. The clay came from specific places. Not generic Earth, but clay from the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm Enki controlled. The blood came from a god described as having sense or intelligence, Geshtu-e, whose name may derive from terms related to consciousness or understanding. The combination of these two elements, according to multiple Sumerian and Akkadian creation accounts, produced beings capable of speech, tool use, organised labour, and critically the ability to maintain complex technological systems. CBS 2168, a tablet fragment at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, preserves part of the myth called Enki and Ninmah. The text describes not a single creation event, but an extended process involving experimentation, failure, and iterative refinement. This is not the only creation account in Mesopotamian literature, but it's the most detailed regarding the technical challenges the Anunnaki encountered. The myth begins after the Igigi rebellion has been resolved in principle. The decision to create humans has been made. Enki and the mother goddess Ninmah, another name for Ninimis Modar, undertake the actual work. But they don't succeed immediately. The text describes Ninmah creating beings that are flawed, unable to hold back urine, lacking sexual organs, neither male nor female. Enki, in each case, finds a social role for these imperfect creations, assigning them positions where their limitations don't matter or become advantages. Then Enki takes his turn. He creates beings with different defects, one with failing eyesight, one with trembling hands, one with paralysed feet. Ninmah, growing frustrated, challenges whether these creations serve any purpose. Enki, again, demonstrates that even imperfect humans can function within society if roles are appropriately assigned. The text reads like a technical troubleshooting session. Two engineers testing prototypes, discovering design flaws, assessing whether flawed units can still be deployed or need to be scrapped and remade. The tone is pragmatic, not mystical. When modern readers encounter this story, the tendency is to interpret it as allegory, perhaps explaining disabilities, or justifying social hierarchies, or teaching moral lessons about accepting imperfection. But the text itself doesn't frame the story that way. It describes a process. Materials are gathered, techniques are attempted, results are evaluated, refinements are made. The final product, functional humans capable of reproduction and labour, emerges from this iterative development, not from instantaneous divine fiat. The Atrahasis account provides different details about the same event. After Geshtu-e is slaughtered and his blood mixed with clay, Nintu shapes 14 pieces, 7 male, 7 female. She gives precise instructions to the birth goddesses who assist her in the house of the destined mother to be who is in labour. Place the bricks for 7 days. The brick of the birth goddess, the wise Mami, is present. Call the mother to be. When she has finished birthing, let them count 10 months. Cut the umbilical cord yourselves. The language is obstetric. The mention of bricks refers to Mesopotamian birthing practices. Women in labour would squat on 2 bricks positioned to allow the midwife access. The counting of months, the 10-month gestation period, Mesopotamian calendars had 10 months of varying length in some reckonings. The cutting of the umbilical cord, these are procedural instructions for managing a biological process, not poetic metaphors. This creates an interpretive problem. If creation was purely divine magic, why describe gestation periods? Why mention birth bricks and midwifery? Why specify cutting the umbilical cord? The text treats human creation as involving biological development, not instantaneous materialization. One way to reconcile this, the clay may be a translation limitation. The Sumerian word tit gets rendered as clay in English, but it can also mean mud, soil, or generically that from which things are formed. If we read it as biological material, cells, genetic material, reproductive material, the process described starts to resemble genetic engineering more than pottery. Mix biological base material with the essence blood, perhaps genetic information of a being possessing consciousness and intelligence. Shape it according to design specifications. Allow it to develop through a gestation process involving biological nurturing. Result: beings who share genetic continuity with earthly biology, the clay, but possess intellectual capabilities derived from the divine component. Modern readers might map this onto genetic modification, hybridization, or directed evolution. The ancient writers obviously didn't have those terms. They used the concepts available to them, fashioning from clay physical raw, mixing with divine blood, non-physical capabilities, gestation and birth, vile development. Whether this reading is correct is almost beside the point. What matters is the text's insistence that human creation involved procedure, not proclamation. Multiple attempts, technical challenges, specific materials, biological development. This is consistent across the various Mesopotamian creation accounts. The process was complex, required expertise, involved collaboration between multiple Anunnaki with different specializations. The Enuma Elish offers yet another version, though briefer and less detailed. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and organizes the cosmos, the gods request relief from labour. Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, proposes creating humans. Marduk agrees, but specifies that one of the gods responsible for instigating Tiamat's rebellion must be punished to provide the necessary material. Kingu, Tiamat's consort who led her army, is executed. E uses Kingu's blood to create humanity. British Museum tablet 93014, described as the bilingual version of the creation account, contains passages describing this event in both Sumerian and Akkadian. The text emphasizes that humans were created from the blood of the god, and that their purpose is to bear the burden of the gods so the divine beings can rest. The repetition of this element, divine blood as essential component, appears across every major Mesopotamian creation account. Human consciousness in these texts is not emergent from complex neural organization. It's inherited from a divine source, literally transmitted through blood that contains something non-physical, something that clay or biological material alone couldn't produce. This creates a hybrid ontology. Humans are of earth, clay, biology, mortality, but also of heavenchousness, intelligence, divine spark. They belong to both realms. They're physical beings who can die and decay, but they possess capabilities that transcend pure materiality, abstract thought, ethical reasoning, artistic creation, mathematical understanding, self-awareness. The texts don't explain how blood transmits consciousness, they simply assert it does. Just as they don't explain how writing words on the tablet of destinies changes reality, or how speaking names brings things into existence, or how the me can be stolen and transported physically while being intangible powers. The Mesopotamian worldview didn't separate material and immaterial the way post-Cartesian Western thought does. Everything was, in a sense, both physical and metaphysical simultaneously. After the initial creation, humans proved reproductively successful, perhaps too successful. The Atrahasis describes rapid population growth. 1,200 years had not yet passed when the land extended and the peoples multiplied. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god got disturbed with their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. The problem wasn't human sinfulness or moral corruption. It was noise and overpopulation. Humans were doing exactly what they were designed to do. Living, working, building, but at a scale that became problematic for gods who apparently still dwelt close enough to human civilization to be disturbed by it. Enlil's solution, as discussed earlier, was population reduction through plague, drought, famine, and ultimately flood. Each measure was designed to decrease human numbers to manageable levels. Each was subverted by Enki, who taught humans medicine, irrigation, fishing, and finally boat building. But notice what this implies about the Anunnaki's capabilities. If they were truly omnipotent, Enki couldn't have subverted Enlil's decrees. If they controlled reality absolutely, human population couldn't have grown beyond what they intended. The texts consistently portray Anunnaki power as real but limited. They can cause drought by withholding rain. But if Enki teaches humans to dig deep wells, the drought doesn't achieve its goal. They can send plague. But if Enki reveals healing techniques, humans survive. This suggests the Anunnaki worked within natural systems, manipulating them but not overriding them. Their knowledge was advanced, their lifespans were long, their technological capabilities were significant, but they weren't controlling every atom and every outcome. They were managing a complex system with imperfect tools and incomplete control. The creation of humanity was successful in its primary objective, providing a labour force that relieved the Igigi from drudgery. But it created downstream problems the Anunnaki hadn't fully anticipated or couldn't easily solve once they emerged. Population dynamics, resource consumption, human autonomy and creativity, the noise of civilization itself. From a human perspective, this is a strange origin story. We're not the pinnacle of creation, beloved children of benevolent deities. We're utilitarian solutions to a workforce shortage. We exist because gods needed workers and decided manufacturing them was easier than doing the work themselves. Our consciousness is a byproduct of that design requirement. You can't maintain complex irrigation systems without problem-solving capability, so humans needed intelligence. But that intelligence, once present, enabled humans to resist divine control, to survive extermination attempts, to develop independent cultures and innovations. The texts describe a creation that was simultaneously successful and problematic. Humans did exactly what they were designed to do. But they also did more than that. They became civilizations, not just labour units. They built cities the Anunnaki didn't plan. They developed technologies the gods hadn't taught. They began, in subtle ways, to exceed their original programming. This theme, humans as created beings who develop beyond their creator's intentions, runs through much of Mesopotamian literature. Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king, seeks immortality against the god's decree that humans must die. He fails, but the attempt itself represents human unwillingness to accept the limitations the Anunnaki imposed. Adapa, the wise man created by Ea, is granted wisdom but denied eternal life. He's too dangerous with both. Etna attempts to reach heaven by riding an eagle, seeking the plant of birth so his wife can conceive. The gods allow him to try, but he falls, suggesting limits to how high humans can ascend. These stories all feature humans pushing against boundaries, attempting to transcend their status, seeking divine attributes that weren't included in their original design. Sometimes they fail, sometimes they partially succeed. But the attempts themselves indicate that human creation, while successful from an engineering standpoint, was unstable from a control standpoint. The Anunnaki created humans intelligent enough to maintain civilization. But that intelligence, once present, couldn't be constrained to only approved purposes. Humans began asking questions, exploring possibilities, challenging structures, seeking knowledge beyond what was granted. This made them valuable, but also dangerous. Enki seems to have anticipated this, or perhaps intended it. He's consistently portrayed as sympathetic to human development, willing to share knowledge even when other Anunnaki object. He teaches humans the healing arts. He reveals agricultural techniques. He shares the secret of writing. He preserves humanity from extinction even when the assembly votes for annihilation. Why? The texts offer hints, but not explicit explanation. Perhaps Enki saw humans as genuinely worth preserving, not just as tools, but as beings with inherent value. Perhaps he saw them as his creation, his project, his responsibility. Or perhaps, and this is speculation beyond what tablets explicitly state, Enki recognized that human intelligence, once activated, represented something genuinely new in the cosmos. Not gods, not animals, something in between that might develop in unexpected directions. Whatever his motivation, Enki's interventions ensured humans survived the crisis points. The flood didn't eliminate humanity, the plagues didn't wipe them out. Each divine attempt at control or reduction was met with Enki-supplied countermeasures that kept human civilization viable. After the flood, when the assembly reversed its decision and allowed humanity to continue, modifications were implemented. Nintu redesigned human reproduction to include infertility, miscarriage, and infant mortality, thereby limiting population growth naturally rather than through catastrophic intervention. Death was made universal. Lifespans were shortened. The king list shows post-flood kings reigning for centuries rather than tens of thousands of years, and contemporary humans living decades rather than the 900 plus years Genesis attributes to early patriarchs. These modifications made humans more controllable but also more mortal. The price of survival was acceptance of limitations. Humans could continue, but as explicitly subordinate, clearly temporary beings who would never challenge divine authority through sheer numbers or longevity. The creation texts, taken together, paint a picture of humanity as engineered beings who succeeded beyond, or in tension with, their design parameters. We were made for a purpose. We fulfilled that purpose. But we also developed our own purposes, our own agendas, our own civilizations that began to function independently of Anunnaki oversight. This sets up the next question. What did the Anunnaki actually give humanity beyond existence? If civilization's components, writing, law, mathematics, architecture, medicine, astronomy, were gifts from the gods rather than human inventions, what exactly was transferred? The texts call these elements me, a Sumerian term with no perfect English equivalent. Understanding the me, what they were and how they moved from divine possession to human custody, reveals what the Anunnaki considered the essential components of civilization, and why keeping those components under control mattered so much to the gods who originally possessed them. Kingship descends from heaven. The well-Blundell prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a clay pillar roughly 8 inches tall, inscribed on all 4 sides with cuneiform text. Catalogued as WB444, it was inscribed around 2100 Tay during the reign of King Utu Hegel of Uruk. The text it contains the Sumerian king list, makes an extraordinary claim in its opening line. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not emerged, not developed, not invented, descended from heaven to a specific city at a specific moment in history. The king list then proceeds to name the kings who ruled in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Jar ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. After Eridu's kingship ended, it moved to Bud Tibira, then to Larak, then to Sipar, then to Shurpak. 8 kings across 5 cities ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years before the flood swept over the land. These numbers are impossible as literal years. No human lives 28,800 years. Scholars have proposed various explanations, different time units, sexagesimal calculation errors during later copying, symbolic numerology, or mythological inflation of genuinely historical rulers' reigns. The University of Chicago Oriental Institute published Thorkild Jacobson's authoritative study of the king list in the Assyriological Studies series, arguing that despite the impossible chronology, the list preserves genuine historical memory of real city-states and actual political succession, but set aside the duration problem momentarily, focus on the structure. The list treats kingship as a discrete phenomenon that moves from city to city but doesn't exist in multiple places simultaneously. When Eridu's kingship ends, it doesn't continue there while also beginning elsewhere. It departs Eridu and arrives in Bad Tabira. Later, after the flood, kingship descends again to Kish. Then it moves to Uruk, then to Ur, then to Awan, cycling through various cities but always singular. This is not how political authority typically develops. Usually, chiefdoms and early states emerge independently in multiple locations, consolidating power through conquest or alliance. Multiple centres of authority coexist, compete, sometimes unify. But the king list presents kingship as a unique attribute that can exist in only one location at a time, transferred deliberately rather than emerging organically. The text uses the phrase, "the kingship was taken to," not kings arose in, or rule was established in, but taken, actively transported, as if kingship were an object or office that could be physically moved. This matches the logic of the me, transferable civilizational templates that exist independent of any specific implementation. If kingship descended from heaven, who sent it down? The king list doesn't explicitly say, but other texts fill the gap. An, the sky god and head of the pantheon, held ultimate sovereignty. Enlil, god of the storm and executor of divine will, administered authority on earth. When the assembly of the Anunnaki decided to establish human governance, they granted kingship to specific cities through specific rituals that legitimized earthly rulers as representatives of divine authority. This system, called the Mesopotamian kingship ideology by scholars, persisted for 3,000 years. Every king, from the earliest Sumerian city-state rulers through the Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods, claimed legitimacy through divine selection. Kings were not gods themselves in Mesopotamian thought, except in the specific case of deified rulers like Naram-Sin or Shulgi, and even then their divinity was granted, not inherent. Kings were mortals chosen by the gods to implement divine will on earth. The selection process involved specific rituals. At Nippur, in Enlil's temple, kings from across Mesopotamia travelled to have their authority confirmed. Without Nippur's endorsement, a ruler might control territory through military force, but lacked legitimate kingship. The temple priesthood consulted omens, performed rituals, and declared whether Enlil accepted the candidate. If accepted, the king received symbolic objects, perhaps a staff, a crown, a throne, that embodied the transferred authority. This is kingship as me, as transferable civilizational function. The king isn't just a powerful individual who seized control. He's an office holder who operates within a system designed by the Anunnaki and maintained by temples that serve as interface points between divine and human realms. The pre-flood kings listed in the king list have fascinating characteristics. Their names are Sumerian, but they're described as ruling during a period when direct divine oversight was still operative. Some of the names include divine elements. Dumuzi, who appears as the 7th king of Bad Tibira for 36,000 years, shares a name with Inanna's husband Dumuzi the shepherd. Is this the same figure? Did gods serve as kings initially before transitioning to human rulers? Or were early human kings named after gods to signify their close connection to divine authority? The text doesn't clarify, but it establishes a clear break. Pre-flood kingship operated under different conditions than post-flood. After the deluge, when kingship descended again to Kish, reign lengths immediately drop. The first king of Kish, Gar-Ur, ruled 1200 years, still impossible, but dramatically shorter than pre-flood reigns. Subsequent kings' reigns continued decreasing until, by the 3rd millennium BC, the list records reigns of decades, plausible durations that match archaeological evidence. This pattern, from mythological deep time to historical time, occurs over the exact period when the texts describe Anunnaki presence, shifting from direct to distant. Pre-flood, gods walk among humans, direct the building of cities, intervene constantly in human affairs. Post-flood, gods are more remote, communication happens through omens and dreams, temples mediate contact, human kings govern with decreasing divine intervention. The flood itself serves as the inflection point. Before it, the Anunnaki apparently dwelt on Earth in some more immediate sense. After it, they withdrew to greater distance. Kingship was their solution to governing humanity remotely, establish human intermediaries, grant them authority through divine selection, structure their role through temple institutions that preserve divine law. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a stone stele around 1750 BC and now housed in the Louvre, opens with Hammurabi claiming, when the lofty Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, who determines the destinies of the land, committed the rule of all mankind to Marduk. When they pronounced the lofty name of Babylon and made it supreme in the world, and established for him in its midst an enduring kingship, then Anu and Enlil named me to promote the welfare of the people, me, Hammurabi, the devout, God-fearing prince, to cause justice to prevail in the land. This is the standard kingship ideology formula. The gods Anu and Enlil, representing heaven and earth authority, chose the city Bulam, established kingship there, selected the specific kings of rule, and granted him authority to implement divine law. Hammurabi doesn't claim to be creating law. He claims to be implementing the gods' justice, making it manifest in the world through specific legal codes. The laws themselves aren't arbitrary. Many match practical needs, property rights, contract enforcement, injury compensation, family law, but they're framed as revealing pre-existing divine standards, not inventing new ones. The stele's top section shows Hammurabi receiving the law from Shamash Ran, the sun god who sees all and judges truth. The visual reinforces the claim law descends from divine source to human implementer. This pattern, divine template, human implementation, structures all Mesopotamian kingship. Kings aren't legislators in the modern sense. They're executors of divine will, administrators of systems the Anunnaki established, maintainers of order the gods defined. Innovation is acceptable only within parameters the gods set. Radical change, especially in religious or legal domains, requires divine sanction through omens or prophetic revelation. But over time, this system allowed human agency to expand. Kings began making decisions based on political calculation, not just temple omens. Laws evolved to address new situations not covered in traditional codes. Military strategy, trade policy, urban planning, these increasingly reflected human judgment, with divine consultation becoming more pro forma, less determinative. The texts document this shift implicitly. Early king inscriptions are saturated with divine references. Every action is at the god's command. Every success is the god's gift. Every building project is for the god's glory. Later inscriptions become more secular in tone, mentioning gods, but emphasizing the king's own wisdom, strength, administrative skill. The gods fade from active participants to background legitimizers. Why did this shift occur? One possibility, the Anunnaki deliberately withdrew, transitioning from direct governance to increasingly distant oversight. They established kingship as an institution that could function with minimal divine intervention, allowing them to focus on other matters or to depart Earth entirely while human civilization continued operating on established protocols. Another possibility, the Anunnaki's ability to intervene decreased over time for reasons the texts don't explain. Perhaps their presence on Earth was always temporary, always sustained by ongoing effort, and that effort eventually became unsustainable. Perhaps something changed in their circumstances that required withdrawing resources and attention from human civilization. Or perhaps, and this is reading between sparse textual lines, the Anunnaki completed their project. If the goal was establishing civilization capable of self-maintenance, mission accomplished. Humans by the 2nd millennium BC had functioning cities, agricultural systems, trade networks, legal codes, astronomical knowledge, medical practice, literary traditions. The me had been successfully transferred and implemented. Ongoing direct supervision was unnecessary. The king list itself supports this interpretation. It moves from mythological time to historical time, from impossible reigns to plausible reigns, from divine selection being obvious and dramatic to divine selection being ritualized and formal. Kingship continues throughout, but it becomes progressively more human, less divine, more about political succession and administrative competence than about gods personally choosing rulers. By the 1st millennium BC, kingship has become almost entirely secularized in practice, even while maintaining divine legitimation in theory. Assyrian and Babylonian kings still claim the gods chose them, but their inscriptions focus on military campaigns, building projects, economic management, human achievements requiring human skills. The gods bless these achievements, but don't appear to direct them closely. This is kingship after the Anunnaki have withdrawn to whatever distance they ultimately reached. The institution they established continues. It evolves, adapts, sometimes collapses and reconstitutes. But it remains the fundamental structure of Mesopotamian political authority for 3,000 years, outlasting any individual dynasty or empire, functioning as the civilizational operating system the Anunnaki installed and then left running while they stepped back from daily management. Understanding kingship as descended rather than emerged reframes how we read the entire political history of Mesopotamia. These weren't humans gradually figuring out governance through trial and error. These were humans implementing a system they were taught, maintaining an institution established by external authority, operating within parameters defined before they were given the me of kingship. This doesn't mean Mesopotamian kings were puppets. It means they were administrators of systems larger and older than themselves, systems they inherited rather than invented. Their genius lay in maintaining, adapting, and occasionally innovating within those systems, not in creating them from scratch. And as kingship became more human and less divine, as the gods' active involvement decreased and kings' autonomous decision-making increased, something fundamental shifted in the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity. The creator-creation dynamic began resembling the parent-child dynamic, initial total dependency, then supervised independence, eventually mature separation where the child functions autonomously while still carrying the parent's legacy. The texts documenting this transition are subtle. They don't announce the gods, departed on this date. They show gradual change in how gods and humans interact, how authority is exercised, how decisions are made. The next step is examining the moment of most acute crisis in that relationship, the moment when the Anunnaki decided human civilization had become problematic enough to warrant total elimination, and the moment one god's defiance preserved humanity despite the collective divine will favouring. Extinction, the Great Disruption, flood accounts. 3 versions of the flood survive in Mesopotamian literature, each from different periods, each with distinctive emphases, but all agreeing on core elements. The Anunnaki decided to destroy humanity through deluge. One god warned a human to build an ark. The flood annihilated everything except what the ark preserved, and afterward the divine-human relationship was restructured, with humans allowed to continue under new conditions. The Eridu Genesis, the earliest version, survives only in fragmentary form on a tablet excavated from Nippur. Large portions are missing, creating frustrating gaps in the narrative. But what remains is clear. The god Enki defied the assembly's decision to destroy humanity. He warned Zisudra, described as a pious king, to build a massive boat. The text gives specific dimensions, though the tablet is damaged precisely where those numbers appear. Zisudra builds the ark, loads it with animals and birds, and survives 7 days and nights of flooding that destroys civilization. When the flood subsides, Ziusudra emerges and offers sacrifice to the sun god Utu. The gods, smelling the offering, gather around, and Enlil, having apparently reconsidered their decision, grant Ziusudra immortality and relocate him to Dilmun, a distant paradisical realm at the mouth of the rivers, where he will live forever as the preserver of humanity. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1700 BCE, provides the most detailed account of the events leading to the flood. As discussed earlier, human population growth created noise that disturbed Enlil's sleep. He attempted population reduction through plague, drought, and famine, each thwarted by Enki's interventions. Finally, Enlil convened the assembly and proposed the flood as a total solution. The assembly agreed. The Anunnaki, meeting in council, voted to eliminate humanity. All the great gods swore an oath not to reveal the plan to humans. Enki, bound by this oath, found his loophole. He spoke to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, knowing Atrahasis was listening on the other side. Reed wall, pay attention. Dismantle your house, build a boat, spurn property, save life. Draw out the boat that you will make on a circular plan. Let her length and breadth be equal. The text provides extensive boat building instructions, materials, structure rather than elongated, roof design completely, size and area of 1 iku, about 3,600 square meters. Atrahasis follows the instructions exactly. He loads the boat with family, craftsmen, animals, and birds. When the rains begin, he enters and seals the door. The flood description is terrifying. The deluge bellowed like a bull. The wind shrieked like an eagle. The darkness was total. There was no sun. The gods were frightened by the deluge. They drew back. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouching outside. This detail is extraordinary. The gods, the Anunnaki who decreed the flood, didn't control it. They unleashed it and then fled before it. They retreated to the highest heaven, cowering, apparently as frightened by what they'd initiated as the humans drowning below. This suggests the flood wasn't a surgical strike. It was overwhelming force, released with imperfect control, threatening even divine beings who thought themselves safe. For 7 days and 7 nights, the storm raged. When it finally ceased, the text describes the sea became calm, the tempest stilled, the flood ceased. All of mankind had turned to clay. The landscape was flat as a roof, everything dead, everything destroyed, the entire human project eliminated. Atrahasis emerges, sees the devastation, and offers sacrifice. The gods, who had retreated to Anu's heaven, and apparently stayed there without access to food offerings, smell the roasted meat and gathered like flies over the sacrifice. The image is undignified. Not majestic deities descending in glory, but desperate beings swarming to a food source after extended deprivation. Enlil arrives, sees the sacrifice, realizes humans survived, and flies into rage. Where did this man escape? No one was to survive the destruction. He accuses the other gods of betraying the oath. Enki admits his role, but defends his action. How could you, without thinking, impose the flood? On the sinner impose his sin, on the transgressor impose his transgression. But ease off, lest he be cut off. Bear with him, lest he perish. This is a remarkable speech. Enki argues for proportional justice. Punish the guilty, not the innocent. Punish actual crimes, not existence itself. Humanity's crime was population growth and noise, not moral corruption or deliberate rebellion. The punishment of total extinction was disproportionate, unjust, counterproductive. Enlil, forced to acknowledge this logic, relents, but he demands modifications to prevent the same problem recurring. The goddess Nintu redesigns human reproduction to include natural population controls. Some women will be infertile, some births will result in miscarriage or stillbirth, some children will die young. Death becomes universal, not exceptional, and the Anunnaki establish greater distance between themselves and humanity, no longer dwelling among humans, but governing through institutional mediators. The third version, Tablet C, of the Gilgamesh epic, presents the story from Utnapishtim's perspective. Gilgamesh, seeking immortality after his friend Enkidu's death, travels to the ends of the earth to find Utnapishtim, the only mortal granted eternal life. When Gilgamesh asks how he achieved immortality, Utnapishtim tells the flood story. Tablet She 3375 at the British Museum preserves the most complete version. Utnapishtim describes Ea Enki's Akkadian now, warning him by speaking to his reed house, O man of Shuruppak, son of Ubaratutu, tear down your house, build a boat. Forsake possessions, keep yourself alive, put aboard the seed of all living creatures. The boat dimensions in this version are specific. Equal shall be her width and her length. Like the Abzu, you shall roof her over. The boat is cubic, about 120 cubits, roughly 60 metres on each side, with 6 decks and 7 levels. Utnapishtim coats it inside and out with bitumen to seal it completely. He loads not just his family but craftsmen of all types, preserving the human knowledge base along with genetic diversity. The storm in Gilgamesh is apocalyptic. At the first glow of dawn, a black cloud rose above the horizon. Inside it, Adad thundered, while Shulat and Hanish went in front, moving as heralds over hill and plain. Erigel tore out the posts of the dams. Ninurta came and made the dikes overflow. The Anunnaki raised their torches, setting the land ablaze with their glare. The stillness of the storm God passed over the sky, and everything that had been bright turned to darkness. The Anunnaki themselves participated in the destruction, wielding elemental forces, storm, fire, flood. But then the gods were frightened by the deluge. They shrank back. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouched against the outer wall. Again the gods flee. Again they cower. The flood they initiated terrified them. Ishtar laments what they've done. How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods, ordering battle to destroy my people, when it is I who give birth to my people? Like spawn of fish they fill the sea. The gods regret the flood while it rages, but they can't stop it. They can only wait for it to run its course. After 7 days, the storm subsides. Utnapishtim opens a window, looks out, sees all of mankind had returned to clay. The landscape was flat as a roof. His boat grounds on Mount Nimush. He releases birds to test for dry land, a dove, a swallow, finally a raven that doesn't return, indicating vegetation has emerged. He exits, offers sacrifice. The gods gathered like flies over the offering. Ishtar arrives, mourning. Then Enlil arrives, enraged that humans survived. E confronts him with the same argument from Atrahasis. How could you, unthinking, bring on this flood? On the sinner lay his sin, on the transgressor lay his transgression. But ease up, lest he be cut off. Bear with him, lest he perish. Instead of your imposing a flood, let lions rise up and diminish the people. Instead of your imposing a flood, let wolves rise up and diminish the people. Instead of your imposing a flood, let famine rise up and devastate the land. Instead of your imposing a flood, let pestilence rise up and plague the land. Ea proposes alternatives, natural population controls, rather than catastrophic elimination. Enlil, persuaded, relents. He grants Utnapishtim and his wife immortality and relocates them to the mouth of the rivers, where they will dwell apart from mortal civilization. All three versions agree on this. One god's defiance saved humanity against the collective will of the Anunnaki assembly. Without Enki Ea's intervention, the flood would have succeeded completely. Human civilization would have ended. The project would have been terminated. Why did Enki repeatedly defy the assembly? The texts offer hints, but not explicit explanation. Perhaps he valued his creation and couldn't bear to see it destroyed. Perhaps he recognized that humanity had become genuinely valuable, worth preserving despite the problems population growth caused. Or perhaps, reading more into the texts than they explicitly state, Enki saw something in humanity that other Anunnaki didn't. Potential for genuine partnership rather than mere servitude. Possibility of civilizational development that could contribute something new rather than just maintaining what the gods established. Whatever his motivation, Enki's actions established a pattern. Divine decisions weren't irreversible, Anunnaki weren't unified, and humans had an advocate in the divine assembly willing to circumvent collective decisions he found unjust. The flood reshaped divine-human relations fundamentally. Before it, the relationship was experimental, the Anunnaki trying different approaches to managing their human workforce, humans learning their role within divine plans. After it, the relationship stabilized into the form it would maintain for millennia. Humans governed themselves under divine descended kingship. Temples mediated contact with distant gods, and the Anunnaki withdrew to whatever realm they had originally descended from, no longer dwelling among humanity, except through increasingly rare interventions. The post-flood world was human-managed in ways the pre-flood world wasn't. Yes, the gods still held ultimate authority. Yes, kings claimed divine selection. Yes, temples maintained the connection. But day-to-day civilization ran on human initiative, human innovation, human administration. The me had been transferred. Humanity knew how to maintain civilization independently. This is what allowed the Anunnaki to withdraw. Their project was self-sustaining. The workforce they created had become administrators, innovators, culture bearers in their own right. Ongoing direct supervision was no longer necessary. The system could run on internal momentum with only occasional divine correction when humanity strayed too far from established parameters. But the flood revealed something else. The Anunnaki were neither omnipotent nor perfectly united. They could initiate forces they couldn't completely control. They could make decisions collectively that some members fundamentally opposed. They could regret their actions mid-implementation, but lack ability to reverse them. They needed what humans provided, offerings, temple maintenance, worship, badly enough that human extinction threatened their own welfare. This is not the portrait of all-powerful deities that mythology typically presents. This is the portrait of advanced, powerful, but limited beings managing a complex situation with imperfect tools and incomplete control. They had significant advantages over humans, knowledge, longevity, technological capability, but they weren't unlimited. Understanding these limitations matters for interpreting what comes next, because if the Anunnaki could be frightened by their own actions, if they needed humanity's offerings, if internal divisions could subvert collective decisions, then their eventual withdrawal from Earth becomes less mysterious. It wasn't defeat, it wasn't ascension to higher planes, it was perhaps simply completion of an assignment followed by departure to whatever their original realm was, leaving behind a civilization that could function without them. But before examining departure, we need to understand one more aspect of Anunnaki presence: their role as judges and fate decreers, the function they performed that humans couldn't replicate, the one remaining area where divine authority remained absolute even as human autonomy increased in other domains, the knowledge they left behind. The Diagnostic Handbook begins with observations, thousands of them, correlated symptoms and outcomes, compiled over generations, encoded in cuneiform across 40 tablets. The most complete version, assembled from fragments at the British Museum, the Louvre and other collections, contains the accumulated medical knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization spanning over 1,000 years. If a patient's right temple throbs, it is hand of a god, he will recover. If a patient's left temple throbs, it is hand of a ghost, that patient will die. If a patient's face is yellow and his eyes are yellow, it is hand of a ghost, that patient will die on the 3rd day. If at the right side of his face there is lump and his face is covered with blood, it is hand of Ishtar, that patient will recover. Symptom, cause, prognosis, sometimes treatment, recorded with empirical precision, statistical correlation between observation and outcome. Modern medical historians analysing these texts have found diagnostic accuracy rates of 60-70% for many conditions, remarkable for a civilization without microscopes, X-rays or germ theory. The British Museum's collection includes numerous medical tablets from the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. These tablets preserve earlier Babylonian medical traditions, which themselves derived from Sumerian sources. The chain of transmission stretches back to the 3rd millennium BC, to the earliest cities, to the period when the Sumerians claimed the Anunnaki established civilization. The texts attribute medical knowledge to specific gods: Gula, also called Ninkarak or Ninisina, the goddess of healing, whose symbol was a dog and whose temple at Essene served as a medical training centre. She is called the Great Physician, she who makes the dead live, mistress of life. Her knowledge wasn't discovered through trial and error. According to temple hymns, it was part of her essential nature, her me, her divine function. Medical texts describe surgical procedures with technical specificity. The Code of Hammurabi includes laws regulating surgeons. If a physician performed a major operation on a nobleman with a bronze lancet and has saved the nobleman's life, or if he opened the eye socket of a nobleman with a bronze lancet and has saved the nobleman's eye, he shall receive 10 shekels of silver. The law also specifies penalties for surgical failure. If a physician performed a major operation on a nobleman with a bronze lancet and has caused the nobleman's death, or he opened the eye socket of a nobleman and has destroyed the nobleman's eye, they shall cut off his hand. These aren't theoretical procedures. Surgeons were operating on eyes, likely for cataracts, with bronze instruments, successfully enough that legal codes needed to regulate the practice. Where did they learn these techniques? The texts say from the goddess, transmitted through temple medical schools where master physicians trained apprentices in diagnostic procedures, pharmacology and surgical methods. The pharmacological knowledge is extensive. Texts describe hundreds of medicinal plants, minerals and animal products, specifying preparation methods and applications. One tablet lists treatments for digestive ailments. If a man's stomach is inflamed, you shall brew beer with dried figs and give it to him to drink. If his stomach continues to be inflamed, you shall pound together frankincense, canactu plant and oil and let him drink it in beer. These aren't superstitious remedies. Figs contain compounds with anti-inflammatory properties. Frankincense has been shown in modern studies to have anti-inflammatory effects. The beer serves as alcohol solvent, extracting medicinal compounds from the plant materials. The ancient physicians were conducting chemistry, empirically finding what worked without understanding the molecular mechanisms. But again, the texts don't claim Mesopotamians discovered these remedies through experimentation. They claim the knowledge came from Gula, who possessed complete medical understanding as part of her divine nature, as one of her me. Humans learned from her, applied her techniques, compiled observational data that refined the base knowledge, but the foundation was transferred, not invented. Similar patterns appear in other knowledge domains. Astronomy provides the clearest example. The Anu Enlil series, named after its opening words, comprises 70 tablets of astronomical omens correlating celestial phenomena with terrestrial events. If on the first day of Nisanu the sunrise looks like scattered charcoal and the sun is surrounded by a halo, there will be rain that year. If Jupiter enters the moon, a king will die. If a lunar eclipse begins in the east and clears in the west, there will be destruction in Elam. These observations require systematic sky watching over extended periods. Eclipse prediction algorithms developed by Babylonian astronomers in the first millennium BC achieved remarkable accuracy. They calculated the Saros cycle, 223 lunar months, about 18 years and 11 days, after which eclipse patterns repeat. They identified planetary periods, allowing prediction of planetary positions years in advance. They mapped the zodiac, tracking the sun's path through constellations and correlating it with seasons. This knowledge wasn't just religious, it was mathematical. The astronomical texts contain sophisticated calculations using sexagesimal 60 notation. The same system modern timekeeping still uses 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Why base 60? Because 60 has 12 factors, making fractional calculations much easier than base 10 systems. Who developed sexagesimal mathematics? The Sumerians attribute it to the gods, particularly to Anu and Enlil, who governed the heavens. The system appears fully formed in early Sumerian mathematics without evident developmental stages. By 2000, Mesopotamian mathematicians were solving quadratic equations, calculating square and cube roots, using place value notation, and working with sophisticated geometric principles. Tablet YBC 7289 at Yale University, dating to around 1800 BCE, shows a square with diagonals and cuneiform numbers indicating the calculation of the square root of 2, accurate to 6 decimal places, 1.414213. This isn't elementary mathematics. This requires theoretical understanding of irrational numbers and sophisticated calculation techniques. Mathematical problem texts preserved from old Babylonian scribal schools show students learning to solve systems of equations, calculate compound interest, divide inheritance according to complex formulas, and work with geometric progressions. The problems aren't just practical, though many address real situations like field measurements and commercial transactions. Some are purely theoretical, exploring mathematical relationships for their own sake. Where did this mathematical sophistication come from? The standard archaeological answer: gradual development over centuries as administrators needed calculation tools for managing large-scale irrigation systems, agricultural production, and commercial trade. Mathematical knowledge emerged from practical needs, refined through generations of problem solving. But the Mesopotamians said it came from the gods. The me of mathematics, of calculation, of measurement, these were divine gifts, part of the civilizational template the Anunnaki provided when kingship descended from heaven and cities were founded. Architecture provides physical evidence of sophisticated technical knowledge from civilization's earliest stages. The White Temple at Uruk, dated to around 3000 BC, sits atop a massive platform built from millions of mud bricks. The structure demonstrates understanding of load-bearing walls, drainage systems, geometric planning, and monumental construction techniques. Later ziggurats, the stepped pyramid temples built across Mesopotamia, required precise engineering to prevent collapse from their own weight and from seasonal flooding. The ziggurat at Ur, partially reconstructed and studied extensively, was built around 2100 BC by King Ur-Nammu. The structure used fired bricks for the facing, more durable than mud, buttressing to support the massive weight, drainage holes to prevent water accumulation, and carefully calculated angles to ensure stability. The builders understood stress distribution, material properties, and complex geometry. Did this engineering knowledge develop gradually? Certainly construction techniques improved over time. Later ziggurats were more sophisticated than earlier ones, but the earliest monumental architecture already demonstrates advanced understanding of principles that required specialized knowledge. Temple architects weren't just builders, they were mathematicians, engineers, and administrators managing complex construction projects involving thousands of workers. The texts attribute architectural knowledge to Enlil and to Enki, who provided the me of building, construction, and city planning. King inscriptions regularly claim that gods provided the plans for temples, that divine instruction guided construction, that the dimensions and orientations were specified by celestial authority. Take these claims at face value for a moment. If gods with advanced knowledge provided templates, mathematical systems, astronomical observation techniques, medical diagnostic procedures, architectural principles, and humans implemented those templates, then civilization's rapid development in the Uruk period, 4300 BC, becomes more explicable. You're not waiting for humans to invent each component through trial and error. You're watching humans implement a transferred knowledge base, learning and adapting systems they were taught rather than discovering from scratch. This doesn't eliminate human agency or innovation. Humans still did the work. Humans refined techniques. Humans made discoveries that extended beyond what was initially taught. The astronomical observations became more precise over centuries. Medical knowledge expanded as physicians encountered new conditions. Mathematical methods became more sophisticated as scribes explored edge cases and theoretical problems. But the foundation, the core knowledge that enabled civilization to function, that was, according to the texts themselves, transferred rather than independently invented. The Anunnaki brought the me. They taught humans how to implement them. And over time, as humans mastered the baseline knowledge, they developed the capacity to extend and innovate beyond what they'd been given. By the first millennium BC, Mesopotamian knowledge in several domains exceeded what could plausibly be attributed to direct divine instruction. The astronomical precision of Neo-Babylonian tablets, the medical sophistication of the diagnostic handbooks, the mathematical elegance of problem texts, these represent centuries of human observation, refinement, and innovation building on a foundation the Anunnaki established, but advancing beyond it. This is perhaps the strongest evidence that the Anunnaki project succeeded. They created beings capable not just of maintaining systems, but of improving them. The humans they fashioned from clay and divine blood proved able to think creatively, solve novel problems, generate new knowledge. The civilization they established became self-developing, capable of progress without ongoing divine instruction. And this success created the conditions for divine withdrawal. If the goal was establishing civilization that could function independently, mission accomplished. If the purpose was creating beings who could maintain Earth's systems without constant Anunnaki oversight, objective achieved. The knowledge had been successfully transferred. Human civilization was operational. The Anunnaki could step back. The text documenting the next phase, the period of increasing divine distance, don't announce departure dramatically. They show it subtly, through changing patterns in how gods and humans interact, how prayers are answered or not answered, how temples function, how kings claim legitimacy. The gods don't leave all at once. They fade progressively over centuries until by the middle of the first millennium BC, divine intervention has become rare enough to be shocking when it occurs, rather than expected as it once was. Understanding what the Anunnaki left behind, the knowledge base that enabled human civilization to function autonomously, is essential for understanding why they could leave. They weren't abandoning a failed project. They were allowing a successful one to continue independently. The parents were letting the children grow up. The diminishment, when gods became distant. The last certain date when a god appeared physically to a human, according to Mesopotamian records, is difficult to pinpoint, not because such events were common and therefore undocumented, but because over the 2nd and 1st millennia BC, divine-human interaction shifts from physical manifestation to dream visions, from direct speech to oracular interpretation, from presence to absence. Temple laments from the Old Babylonian period, 2100, already express this shift. The lament for Sumer and Ur, composed after the destruction of Ur by Elamite invaders around 2000 BC, describes the gods abandoning their cities. Enlil called the storm, the people groan. The storm that annihilates the land he called, the people groan. The great storm of heaven he called, the people groan. The land-annihilating storm he called alongside it. Enlil brought the Elamites, the enemy, out of the mountains. Ninlil brought the Gutians down from the mountains, but after describing the destruction, the text laments, the gods have abandoned us like migrating birds. Smoke lies on our city like a shroud. The gods didn't fight to protect their cities. They left. They withdrew their presence, allowing human conflicts to resolve through human means. This represented a fundamental change from earlier periods when divine intervention in warfare was expected and frequently described in royal inscriptions. Earlier texts from the 3rd millennium BC routinely describe gods leading armies, fighting alongside kings, determining battle outcomes directly. The Still of the Vultures, dating to around 2450 BC and now partially preserved in the Louvre, shows the god Ningirsu directly intervening in battle, catching enemies in a net. King Eannatum of Lagash, who commissioned the stele, claims Ningirsu personally instructed him in battle tactics and granted victory. But by the Old Babylonian period, such direct divine warfare has become rare. Gods still receive credit for victories, kings still claim divine favour, but the mechanisms shift. Instead of gods physically fighting, they grant omens indicating favourable or unfavourable conditions. Instead of personal instruction, they communicate through dreams requiring priestly interpretation. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its standard Babylonian version compiled around 1200 BC, shows this transition clearly. Gilgamesh receives dreams before key events, before his friendship with Enkidu begins, before the battle with Humbaba, before the Bull of Heaven attacks. But the dreams require interpretation. They're ambiguous, symbolic, needing expert analysis to extract meaning. Gilgamesh relies on his mother Ninsun to explain them, and even she sometimes struggles to provide clear interpretation. This is radically different from earlier divine human communication. When Enlil spoke to Ziusudra about the flood, the instructions were clear: build a boat, specific dimensions, waterproof it completely, load animals. When Enki spoke through the reed wall to Atrahasis, the information was precise and actionable. But dreams? Dreams require specialists, professional diviners, who study omen texts and precedents to extract probable meanings. The shift from clarity to ambiguity indicates the gods are withdrawing not just physically, but communicatively. They're still sending signals, but faintly, indirectly, through channels that introduce noise and uncertainty. Like a radio station gradually moving out of range, The signal persists, but becomes harder to receive clearly, more subject to interference, eventually fading to static. Temple economics reveal the same pattern. Earlier temples were described as dwelling places where gods physically resided, eating the offerings brought by worshippers. The daily temple ritual, documented in countless administrative texts, involved feeding the divine statue multiple meals, morning, afternoon, evening, elaborate preparations, specific foods, proper serving procedures, and the god was understood to consume these meals spiritually, deriving sustenance from them. But by the first millennium BC, the theological understanding shifts. The god doesn't need the food physically. The god is distant, perhaps not even residing in the statue, but merely represented by it. The offerings become symbolic, maintaining relationship, but not literally feeding divine beings. Priests develop sophisticated theological explanations for why offerings continue if gods don't materially need them. Relationship maintenance, symbolic communication, preserving sacred covenant. This represents a profound theological evolution. Earlier Mesopotamian religion was transactional, humans provide offerings, gods provide protection and prosperity. It was contractual, both parties had obligations, both gained benefits. But as gods become distant, the transaction becomes one-sided. Humans continue offerings, but divine response becomes unpredictable, often absent entirely. The poem of the righteous sufferer, sometimes called the Babylonian Job, expresses this crisis. Composed around 1000 BC, it describes a pious man who suffers despite maintaining perfect temple service and ethical conduct. I look behind me, persecution, tribulation. As one who has not made libations to his god, nor invoked his goddess when he ate, did not make prostration, nor give reverence, whose prayer was not made, who abandoned the festival days, was negligent, although I, for my part, was mindful of supplication and prayer was my concern. Sacrifice my rule, the day of the worship of the gods, my delight, yet what seems good to oneself can be displeasing to one's god. What seems bad to oneself can be good to one's god. Who can understand the will of the gods in heaven? Who can grasp the intentions of the underworld gods? The sufferer's crisis isn't just personal misfortune, it's theological confusion. He did everything right according to traditional understanding, prayers, offerings, ethical conduct. Yet the gods didn't reciprocate. They didn't protect him. They became incomprehensible, their will unknowable, their presence absent despite proper ritual observance. This text was enormously popular, copied repeatedly, clearly speaking to widespread experience. Many Mesopotamians were encountering divine absence despite maintaining traditional worship. The transactional system was breaking down. Gods no longer reliably responded to proper ritual performance. Why? One theological explanation, developed by Babylonian and Assyrian scholars, was that divine will had always been inscrutable. Human suffering wasn't punishment for specific sins, but part of mysterious divine plans beyond human comprehension. This preserved divine justice theoretically, while explaining empirical absence practically. But the texts themselves suggest a different explanation. The gods were withdrawing, not abandoning humanity entirely, but stepping back to greater distance, no longer intervening regularly in human affairs, allowing civilization to run on the systems they'd established without ongoing direct management. Royal inscriptions from the Neo-Assyrian period, 9111-699-6, still claim divine authority for kingship, still credit gods with military victories, still describe temple construction as divinely commanded. But the language becomes increasingly formulaic, more ritualistic than descriptive. Earlier kings described actual divine encounters, dreams with clear messages, omens with specific meanings, personal audiences with gods in temple sanctuaries. Later kings recite traditional formulas without adding specific details that would indicate genuine divine communication. The prayers become more desperate. Earlier prayers request specific favours, victory in battle, cure for illness, prosperity for the city. Later prayers beg simply for divine attention. Look upon me, O Lord, accept my prayers, hear my supplications, do not abandon your servant. The goal shifts from getting specific help to getting any divine response at all, any confirmation that the god is listening. Assyrian kings in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE still performed divination before major campaigns, consulting specialists who examined sheep livers for omens indicating divine will. But the system was becoming mechanical, procedural. Follow the protocols, perform the rituals, interpret the signs according to established rules. The personal connection, the sense of gods actively communicating specific guidance, had largely faded. By the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, 626-539, the last native Mesopotamian empire before Persian conquest, divine activity had become almost entirely passive. The gods existed, their temples were maintained, their festivals celebrated, but they didn't do anything observable. They didn't appear, didn't speak, didn't intervene. They'd become theological abstractions rather than active participants in civilization. Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king, 556-539 B6, tried to reform this situation. He excavated ancient temples, restored old rituals, attempted to reconnect with the religious practices of earlier periods when gods had been more active. His inscriptions describe finding foundation deposits from Sumerian kings 2,000 years earlier, reading their records and attempting to recreate what they had done when gods still walked among humans. But Nabonidus's reforms failed. The priests opposed them as innovations rather than restorations. The populace didn't respond to the old rituals. The gods remained silent. When Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he presented himself as liberator, claiming Marduk, chief god of Babylon, had abandoned Nabonidus for his impiety and chosen Cyrus instead. Did Marduk actually choose Cyrus? The Persian king made the claim, Babylonian priests endorsed it, and the people accepted it. But no one reported actually hearing Marduk speak. No one described a divine encounter, a theophany, a direct communication. The claim relied entirely on circumstantial interpretation. Cyrus won, therefore Marduk must have favoured him. The mechanics of divine intervention had been replaced by theological inference after the fact. This represents the end point of a process lasting over a millennium. The Anunnaki, who had once descended from heaven, established cities, taught humans civilization, walked among mortals, and gave direct instructions, those gods had become distant abstractions. Theological concepts invoked to explain events, but no longer visibly active in causing them. Temple theology developed elaborate explanations for this absence. The gods hadn't left entirely, they transcended, ascending to higher realms of existence where they remained concerned with human affairs, but operated through subtle influences rather than direct manifestation. They communicated through signs requiring expert interpretation, astrology, hepatoscopy, divination, dream analysis, rather than through clear speech. They preferred symbolic worship to physical feeding, relationship to transaction, faith to evidence. These theological developments preserved the gods' relevance despite their empirical absence, but they also represented a fundamental shift from earlier Mesopotamian religion. The Anunnaki had been physically present, materially engaged, actively governing. Their descendants, the gods of first millennium Mesopotamian religion, were spiritually present, theologically necessary, but practically absent. Where did they go? The texts don't say explicitly. They describe abandonment, withdrawal, transcendence, but not departure to a specific location. They describe gods becoming distant, silent, inactive, but not ceasing to exist. The temples remain. The theology continues. The civilization they established functions without them. One possibility, the Anunnaki completed their mission. They established civilization, transferred the me, ensured humanity could maintain Earth's systems independently. With the project successfully operational, they returned to whatever heavenly realm they descended from, leaving behind a self-sustaining human civilization that no longer required direct oversight. Another possibility: something changed in the Anunnaki's circumstances that required reallocating resources and attention elsewhere. Earth was no longer the priority it once was. The workforce they'd created was sufficient for maintaining the planet. They could withdraw to focus on other concerns, other projects, other worlds perhaps, or perhaps the withdrawal was always planned. The texts describe kingship descending from heaven for a purpose, establishing human governance as an alternative to direct divine rule. If the goal was transitioning from divine administration to human self-governance, the gradual withdrawal makes sense as deliberate policy rather than abandonment. The late period first texts don't mourn divine absence uniformly. Some lament it, viewing it as punishment or abandonment, but others present it as maturation, humanity growing into independence, no longer needing the direct supervision that characterized earlier periods. The Babylonian creation myth Enuma Elish, in its canonical form compiled around 1200 BC, ends with Marduk establishing cosmic order and receiving praise from all the gods. But the closing sections focus on Marduk's names, 50 names, each describing an attribute or function. The text becomes a theological treatise on divine attributes rather than a narrative of divine actions. This shift from story to theology reflects the broader shift from active gods to conceptual gods, from beings you might encounter to ideas you contemplated. By the Persian period, 539-331 BC, when Mesopotamia was incorporated into a vast empire stretching from Egypt to India, the old gods had become cultural heritage rather than active presences. Their temples were maintained, their festivals celebrated, their myths recounted, but primarily as preservation of ancient tradition rather than as living interaction with present deities. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 331 B and died in Babylon in 323 B, he allegedly consulted with Babylonian astrologers who warned him against entering the city. But the consultation was about reading celestial omens, not about asking gods directly. Even at this late date, the system persisted, but it had become mechanical, procedural, a discipline for interpreting patterns rather than a relationship with active divine beings. The Anunnaki's withdrawal transformed Mesopotamian civilization from theocracy to something more resembling secular monarchy with religious legitimation. Kings still claimed divine authority, but they governed based on political and military considerations rather than divine instruction. Temples remained economically and culturally important, but as institutions preserving tradition rather than as interfaces with present gods. This transformation allowed Mesopotamian civilization to survive even after the gods had withdrawn. The systems the Anunnaki established, kingship, temple organization, legal codes, agricultural techniques, mathematical methods, astronomical knowledge, these continued functioning because they were now human-operated rather than divinely managed. The withdrawal didn't collapse civilization, it matured it. By understanding this gradual distancing, this progressive reduction in divine intervention over more than a millennium, we can see the Anunnaki's departure not as sudden abandonment, but as planned withdrawal. They established civilization, they transferred knowledge, they verified humans could maintain systems independently, and they stepped back progressively until they were gone, leaving behind everything needed for human civilization to continue without them. What departure would mean? 3 interpretations dominate scholarly approaches to Anunnaki texts. Each is defensible. Each has evidentiary support. Each leads to radically different conclusions about what these texts represent. Interpretation 1. Pure mythology. The standard academic position: Anunnaki texts are mythology in the conventional sense. Ancient Mesopotamians invented gods to explain natural phenomena, to provide social cohesion, to legitimize political authority, to answer existential questions about human origins and purpose. The gods never existed as actual beings. They're personifications of natural forces, Raum gods, sun gods, fertility goddesses, or projections of human psychology goddesses, warrior gods, trickster gods. In this reading, the Anunnaki are no different from Zeus and the Olympian pantheon, or Odin and the Norse gods, or any other ancient mythology, interesting as literature, valuable as cultural artifacts, revealing about the societies that created them, but not describing real events or real beings. This interpretation explains why we have no archaeological evidence of extraterrestrial presence, no artifacts that couldn't have been made with Bronze Age technology, no physical remains of beings who lived for thousands of years. The texts describe impossible reigns, impossible achievements, impossible beings because they're mythological narratives, not historical records. The archaeological evidence supports this. Mesopotamian civilization shows clear developmental progression from Ubaid period villages to Uruk period cities. Each technological innovation has developmental stages. Pottery improves gradually. Architecture becomes more sophisticated over time. Writing evolves from simple counting tokens to complex cuneiform script. This looks like human development, not transferred alien technology. The mythological interpretation is intellectually safe, methodologically sound, and consistent with materialist assumptions about reality. It requires no extraordinary explanations, invokes no unverifiable entities, fits comfortably within established academic frameworks. Interpretation 2. Encoded wisdom. A middle position, the texts encode philosophical and spiritual wisdom in mythological form. The Anunnaki aren't literal beings, but symbolic representations of cosmic principles, stages of consciousness development, or initiatic knowledge preserved in allegorical narratives. In this reading, descent from heaven means descent of consciousness into matter, the soul's incarnation into physical reality. Creation of humanity from clay and divine blood represents the dual nature of human existence, physical body animated by divine consciousness. The flood symbolizes spiritual purification, cleansing of lower nature, rebirth into higher consciousness. This interpretation has ancient precedent. Neoplatonist philosophers in late antiquity read Greek myths allegorically, finding profound metaphysical truths encoded in stories of gods and heroes. Medieval scholars interpreted Mesopotamian myths as prefigurations of Christian truths. Modern esoteric traditions read Sumerian texts as preserving ancient mystery school teachings. This approach respects the text's spiritual significance while not requiring literal belief in supernatural events. It acknowledges that ancient wisdom traditions often encoded knowledge in narrative form to preserve it across generations and to restrict access to qualified initiates who could decode the symbolism. The evidence for this includes the fact that Mesopotamian texts were layered, they had surface meanings accessible to all, and deeper meanings understood only by trained priests and scribes. Temple schools taught not just literacy, but hermeneutics, the interpretation of hidden meanings in sacred texts. Divination treatises explicitly state that texts have both obvious and concealed significance. This interpretation allows modern readers to find ongoing value in ancient texts without dismissing them as primitive superstition or accepting them as literal history. It preserves the text's wisdom while translating them into philosophical frameworks compatible with contemporary understanding. Interpretation 3. Historical documentation. The most controversial position. The texts preserve genuine historical memory of actual events involving non-human intelligences. the Anunnaki were real beings, whether extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or highly advanced terrestrial civilization, who interacted with early humans, established civilization, and eventually departed. In this reading, the texts mean approximately what they say. Kingship descended from heaven describes transfer of governance knowledge from advanced beings to humans. Creation of humanity from clay and divine blood describes genetic engineering or hybridization. The flood records an actual catastrophe, possibly targeted, possibly accidental, from which a small population survived with advance warning from a sympathetic Anunnaki. This interpretation takes seriously the text's consistent insistence that they're describing real events. It notes that ancient historians like Berossus, writing in Greek during the Hellenistic period, treated early Mesopotamian king lists and god narratives as history, not mythology. It points out that the Sumerians themselves made no clear distinction between mythological and historical texts. Both used the same narrative conventions, both were preserved in the same archives, both were treated as recording the past. The evidence for this includes anomalies in the archaeological record that don't fit smoothly with gradual development models. The sudden appearance of sophisticated writing around 3400 BCE, the rapid urbanization of the Uruk period, the advanced mathematics and astronomy present in early Sumerian texts, the fact that the Sumerians themselves claim they didn't invent these things but received them. This interpretation is academically controversial because it requires accepting that mainstream archaeology has missed or misinterpreted significant evidence. It implies that human development wasn't entirely independent, that civilization's origins involve intervention or assistance from non-human intelligence. It opens possibilities that make many scholars deeply uncomfortable precisely because they can't be easily proved or disproved. Evaluating the interpretations. Each interpretation has strengths and weaknesses. Pure mythology explains the impossible elements, 28,800-year reigns, gods who eat and require sleep, contradictions between different texts. But it struggles to explain why the Sumerians would invent such specific, procedurally detailed myths rather than simpler creation stories. Why describe multiple failed attempts at creating humans if the story is just symbolism? Why include technical details about boat building and medical diagnosis if the point is religious meaning? Encoded wisdom preserves the text's profundity without requiring literal belief, but it risks overreading, projecting modern philosophical concepts onto ancient texts that might have meant something completely different to their original authors. It can become unfalsifiable. Any apparent contradiction or impossibility gets explained as symbolic without clear criteria for when to read literally versus allegorically. Historical documentation takes the texts at face value, which has a certain methodological honesty. Why not believe what the texts claim about themselves? But it requires accepting extraordinary claims, human intelligences intervening in human affairs, without extraordinary evidence. The archaeological record doesn't obviously support it, though advocates argue we're looking for the wrong things or interpreting evidence within incorrect frameworks. The intellectually honest position is probably we don't know. The texts are genuinely ambiguous. They could be mythology that happens to include realistic procedural detail. They could be allegory that happens to map onto historical chronology. They could be historical memory distorted by millennia of oral transmission and theological reinterpretation. What's clear is that the texts describe a coherent narrative. Beings from elsewhere arrived, established civilization, eventually withdrew. Whether this narrative describes real events, encodes spiritual truths, or reflects pure human imagination remains genuinely uncertain. But if, and this is speculative, not conclusive, if the historical interpretation has merit, what would it mean? It would mean human civilization is not entirely human in origin, that the baseline knowledge enabling complex societies came from outside, was transferred rather than independently developed. This doesn't diminish human achievement. Humans still did the work, still refined the knowledge, still built the cities and composed the literature and made the discoveries. But it means we started from a template, learned from teachers, received an inheritance we've spent the past 5,000 years exploring and extending. It would mean we're not necessarily alone in the universe. The Anunnaki, wherever they came from, represent at least one other intelligence capable of space travel or dimensional crossing, capable of genetic engineering or hybridization, capable of establishing civilization on planets that didn't originally have it. It would mean the question of return remains open. If they came once, they could come again. If they monitored Earth for millennia before withdrawing, they might still be monitoring from whatever distance they now maintain. If they established protocols and boundary conditions they expected humans to maintain, violation of those protocols might trigger response. Or it might mean the project is complete and abandoned. Earth was transformed from raw planet to civilized world. Humanity was created, educated, set up for independent operation. The Anunnaki moved on to other projects, other worlds, other civilizations. We're living in the ruins of their installation, maintaining systems we didn't entirely design, operating within parameters we didn't fully choose. These implications are profound enough that most scholars prefer the safer interpretations. Mythology is comfortable, allegory is respectable, but historical documentation opens possibilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness, civilizational independence, and our place in cosmic history. The texts themselves don't resolve this. They present their narratives without meta-commentary about whether to read them literally or symbolically. They were written for audiences who lived in a world where gods were simply part of reality, where supernatural and natural weren't sharply distinguished, where receiving knowledge from divine sources was no more remarkable than receiving it from human teachers. We read them from a world with different assumptions, where supernatural is suspect, where human independence is prized, where the burden of proof for extraordinary claims is deliberately set very high. Both perspectives have validity. Neither can definitively prove the other wrong. What we can say with certainty, the Sumerians believed the Anunnaki were real, had been present, and had withdrawn. They structured their entire civilization around maintaining what the Anunnaki had established. They preserved these stories in thousands of tablets precisely because they considered them important, worth copying, worth protecting, worth transmitting to future generations. Whether those future generations, us, should accept these texts as history, honour them as wisdom, or appreciate them as mythology remains an open question. But the texts exist. They tell their story consistently across thousands of years. And that story, however we interpret it, describes humanity's relationship with beings who came from elsewhere, taught us civilization, and eventually departed, leaving us to continue what they started. The archive and the question. The tablet is back in its climate-controlled drawer at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. CBS 4561, the creation myth of Enki and Nimma, preserved in baked clay, catalogued and photographed and translated. You could visit it if you wanted. You could request access to the collections, follow the protocols, see it with your own eyes, this 4,000-year-old record of humanity's origins as the Sumerians understood them. The same for the other tablets cited throughout this investigation. K3375 at the British Museum, the Gilgamesh flood account, the Weld Blundell prism at the Ashmolean, the King list claiming kingship descended from heaven, the Atrahasis fragments at the Louvre, CBS 13932, Inanna's descent, the Enuma Elish tablets scattered across museum collections worldwide. These aren't secrets. They're not hidden knowledge available only to initiates. They're public archives, accessible to anyone willing to learn cuneiform or read academic translations. The evidence this investigation examined exists in climate-controlled storage, professionally catalogued, academically studied, published in scholarly editions. What makes these texts remarkable isn't that they're hidden, it's that they're ignored. Most people who encounter Mesopotamian mythology do so through popular retellings that smooth out the uncomfortable details, that present the stories as obviously symbolic, that don't mention the procedural specificity or the consistent cross-textual patterns. The originals are stranger than the summaries suggest. They describe events with circumstantial detail that doesn't feel like pure invention. They preserve knowledge sophisticated enough to remain useful millennia later. They present gods who act less like omnipotent deities and more like powerful but limited beings managing a complex project with imperfect control. You've now encountered the primary evidence. The tablets exist. The translations are verifiable. The patterns are real. What you make of them, mythology, wisdom, history, some combination, is genuinely your decision to make. The standard academic interpretation has substantial support. Mesopotamian civilization shows clear developmental progression in archaeological record. The impossible chronologies in texts are obviously impossible. The simplest explanation for God stories is that humans invented gods, not that gods existed and eventually left. But simple explanations aren't always complete explanations. The texts themselves insist they're recording real events. The Sumerians made no distinction between mythological and historical narratives. Both used identical conventions. Both were preserved as records of the past. Taking them seriously doesn't require credulity, just willingness to examine claims before dismissing them. 3 possibilities remain open. 1. The Anunnaki were entirely mythological, invented by ancient Mesopotamians to explain their world, to justify social hierarchies, to provide meaning and purpose. The texts are literature, valuable as cultural artifacts, but not as historical records. Civilization developed through gradual human innovation. The Sumerians told themselves they received knowledge from gods, but really they developed it slowly through trial and error, then retroactively attributed it to divine teaching. 2. The Anunnaki texts encode spiritual truths in narrative form. They're not describing physical beings, but representing cosmic principles, consciousness development, or initiatic knowledge. Reading them allegorically reveals profound wisdom about human nature, the structure of reality, and the path of spiritual development. They were always meant symbolically, understood that way by ancient priests, even if later readers took them literally. 3. The Anunnaki were real, beings from elsewhere who came to Earth, established civilization, created or modified humanity, governed directly for a period, then gradually withdrew as human civilization proved capable of independent operation. The text preserved genuine historical memory, distorted by millennia of transmission, but fundamentally accurate about the sequence of events, arrival, activity, departure. Which interpretation is correct? The evidence examined here doesn't conclusively prove any of them. It presents what the texts actually say, what archaeological evidence supports, what patterns emerge from careful reading, what problems each interpretation faces. You're left in the same position the texts leave us all, looking at ancient records that describe gods walking among humans, teaching civilization, then withdrawing to distance. Either those gods existed and left, or they never existed and the whole narrative is human imagination, or they represent truths deeper than simple materialism or simple mythology allows. The texts won't resolve the question for you. They present their narrative consistently across thousands of years and thousands of tablets. But they don't provide the kind of evidence modern skepticism demands. Physical artifacts beyond Bronze Age capability, dinner proof of genetic engineering, astronomical observations that Bronze Age humans couldn't have made. What they provide instead is testimony. Thousands of tablets saying this is what happened. Beings came from heaven. They established cities, taught knowledge, created workers to maintain Earth. They governed through assembly and hierarchy. They disagreed among themselves. One god repeatedly saved humanity from others' decisions. They established kingship as remote governance. They gradually withdrew over centuries until they were functionally absent by the first millennium BC. Is testimony enough? That depends on what you demand as proof. Scientific materialism says testimony without physical evidence is insufficient. Historical method says widespread, consistent testimony across long periods should be taken seriously even if we can't physically verify it. Spiritual traditions say some truths are known through revelation rather than through material proof. The texts exist. The civilization they describe existed. The knowledge they claim was transferred from gods to humans includes mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering sophisticated enough that we still use some of it. The pattern they describe, divine presence, knowledge transfer, gradual withdrawal, matches the theological evolution visible in texts spanning 3 millennia. Whether this describes events or encodes wisdom or reflects mythology, the story is complete. The Anunnaki descended from heaven. They established civilization on Earth. They created or modified humanity to maintain what they built. They governed directly, then through intermediaries, then from distance. They withdrew progressively over more than a millennium. By the time Mesopotamian civilization ended, absorbed into Persian then Greek, then Roman empires, the gods who had founded it were long gone, remembered in temple ritual, preserved in cuneiform archives, but no longer present, no longer active, no longer directly shaping human affairs. We live in the world they left behind, if they existed. Or we live in the world humans built while telling themselves stories about gods, if they didn't. The cities remain, rebuilt, renamed, but in the same locations where kingship first descended from heaven. The knowledge remains, refined, extended, but built on foundations the Sumerians claim they received rather than invented. The questions remain: who were we created by or for? What were we meant to become? Are we still observed from whatever distance they withdrew to, or are we alone now, managing Earth without the overseers who established it? The archive preserves the question without answering it definitively. The tablets sit in museum drawers, available to anyone curious enough to examine them. The story they tell is internally consistent, remarkably detailed, and profoundly strange, describing divine human interaction that either happened or is the most elaborate invention in human history. You've heard the evidence. You've encountered the primary sources. You've seen what mainstream scholarship says and what the texts themselves claim. The conclusion is yours to reach, the interpretation yours to choose, the implications yours to explore. The Anunnaki, if they existed, completed their project and departed. Humanity continues independently, for better or worse, managing the civilization they established, or that humans built while believing gods established it. The distinction matters theoretically, but perhaps not practically. We're here, civilization functions, knowledge accumulates, and whether we receive the baseline from elsewhere or developed it ourselves. We're responsible now for what happens next. The texts are silent about return. They document departure without promising restoration. Whatever the Anunnaki were, gods, aliens, advanced ancestors, or mythological projections, they're not here now in any obvious sense. We've inherited Earth, inherited civilization, inherited the question of our origins without clear answer. That's where the evidence leaves us. Not with certainty, but with profound questions. Not with proof, but with testimony demanding evaluation. Not with simple answers, but with the complexity that truth, when you examine it carefully, usually turns out to contain. The archive remains open. The tablets await. the story is told. What it means, what you do with it, how you understand humanity's place in a cosmos that might be empty or might be crowded with intelligences like the Anunnaki, that's the question they left for us to answer. Sleep on it. Let the patterns settle. Let the evidence rest in your mind alongside your assumptions and skepticism and curiosity. The Anunnaki story, however you interpret it, describes a transition from being created and guided to being independent and self-determining, from childhood to maturity, from dependence to autonomy. We're in the autonomous phase now, if we ever weren't. The gods, if they existed, have left us to continue what they started, or we've always been alone, building civilization ourselves, while telling ourselves stories about gods to make the loneliness bearable. Either way, the archive preserves the question, and the question remains worth asking, even if no definitive answer arrives, because understanding where we came from, whether from gods or from ourselves, shapes everything about where we're going and who we choose to become. The entire story, from arrival to departure, rests in cuneiform tablets in climate-controlled drawers. Visit them if you doubt. Read the translations if you're curious. Examine the evidence if you're skeptical. It's all there, preserved in clay, waiting 4,000 years for someone to ask the question properly and follow where the evidence leads. The Anunnaki descended from heaven, the texts say, and eventually they left. Everything else, why they came, what they did, whether they'll return, whether they existed at all, remains interpretation, possibility, question without certain answer. The archive is patient. The tablets will outlast us all, as they've outlasted everyone who wrote them. The story continues, whether as history or wisdom or mythology, and somewhere in those ancient words, pressed into clay before they hardened into permanence, lies something worth preserving, something that made the Sumerians write it down, the Babylonians copy it, the Assyrians archive it, and modern museums protect it. What that something is, you now have the evidence to decide for yourself. The entire story, from arrival to departure, has been told. What remains is the question each person must answer alone. Do I believe them?